More than 4 years after the Supreme Court authorized commercial sports betting, during which time 2/3 of the state signed on, Massachusetts lawmakers have reached a deal to legalize it in this state, both virtually and in person. And while the exact when and where is still to be determined, in-person betting at least could very well be here in Massachusetts by the Super Bowl. And while legalized betting has plenty of supporters who view this change as long overdue, including Governor Charlie Baker, some have concerns about possible risks. I'm joined by David Friedman, Executive Vice President of Legal and Government Affairs and Chief Compliance Officer for the Boston Red Sox. Marlene Warner is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Council on Gaming and Health. Welcome to you both. Good to see you both.
Thank you.
Great to see you, Jim.
And you as well, David. David, starting with you, 10 years ago, the Commissioner of Baseball, Bud Selig, testified in front of some body in New Jersey that was contemplating legalizing sports betting there. He said he was appalled and that gambling is evil, creates doubt, and destroys your sport. 10 years later, not just the Red Sox, every pro sports team in town is a supporter of this legislation. What happened? DraftKings? I mean, what happened?
It's a good question, Jim, and it really is quite a turnaround during history. In a nutshell, I think once NBA Commissioner Adam Silver came publicly to the conclusion that there's already a lot of illegal sports betting happening in town today, all the leagues and teams reflected on that and thought, you know, at the end of the day, given how much illegal activity is happening, it makes sense to try to have a legal market that's regulated, that protects consumers better and also protects the integrity of the game. And it's kind of as simple as that.
But it's a growth strategy too, obviously. There's nothing wrong with that. It is, right?
The leagues and teams think that there's some fan engagement that could be a benefit to having sports betting legalized. And so, yeah, we think that this is a place where there's some opportunity. And now, after the past 4 years when different states have legalized sports betting, we're getting to see how that plays out.
So, Marlene, my understanding is your organization isn't pro or con the legislation. You just raise concerns about the possible risks about gambling and addiction. So what are those concerns? And there are a lot of safeguards built into this legislation. Did they satisfactorily address your concerns?
You know, they did an excellent job, not unlike the 2011 Expanded Gaming Act. We are really leaders here in Massachusetts among the United States and certainly in even some other jurisdictions outside the United States. I'd say that they did a really nice job. There are a few areas where we'd like to see some additional improvements, but listen, you know, the Mass Gaming Commission will put this into regulation. They've done a nice job. They can be trusted.
Well, yeah, no credit cards, which I think is huge. You can only spend the money essentially.
Credit extension.
What's that again?
And no credit extension.
That's great. I didn't know that. You got to be at least 21. There's regulations around ads. There's a 9% of the revenue goes into a public health fund to address your kind of concerns. But you said they could have done more. Like what?
So, I mean, one of the things you just talked about was advertising. I mean, one of the things we know is that a lot of the companies that will vie for a license here have just received a license in Ontario and are meeting much more stringent guidelines around advertising. You know, one of the things we'd like to see is whistle-to-whistle ban on advertising so that anyone who is watching is not being bombarded with gambling advertisements and really paying attention. I mean, there is some language in there in terms of the folks that are going to be receiving those ads, but making sure, you know, for example, it says no ads going to people on the self-exclusion list. We'd like to make sure that it's for anyone who's at high risk and not just on the self-exclusion list.
You know, David, my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, you're much more involved in this than I am, starts with casinos, the 3 casinos, then moves online. And there's a study in place where kiosks, even at places like Fenway, could ultimately happen. Is that an accurate retelling of what this legislation does?
That's right. Although the study doesn't automatically do anything, the legislature would still have to come back and affirmatively allow for additional in-person sites like kiosks.
So just to be clear, I want to repeat what you said back to you. Even if this study or this commission or whatever the hell it is decides kiosks were appropriate and, let's say, obviously relevant to your life, appropriate at Fenway, they'd need to pass additional legislation to make that happen?
That's right. The legislation that the legislature just passed, that the governor still needs to sign for it to be law, has a licensing process, and there are specific licenses that are allowed, but there's no license allowed under this legislation for kiosks anywhere. You know, they'll be at the casinos, not kiosks, but in-person betting. So the legislature would have to come back and add other places like kiosks or pro sports venues.
Would you like kiosks at Fenway?
We had a lot of discussion with legislators about the idea of retail in-person sports betting near venues. We think that it's an attractive idea, but we're very pleased with the legislation that passed. And so I think we're happy to see how it goes once it's launched and what the market looks like. And then we'll talk to people as they study the issue.
David, in the 33 states that have done this so far, I think it's 33 in DC, but roughly that number, I would have assumed that the largest percentage of gambling where it's permitted would be online. Am I wrong about that or no?
That is absolutely correct from all the data we've seen, yes.
So, Marlene, you mentioned the Gaming Commission. Steve Crosby used to chair it, used to sit across from me here and go out of his way to talk about all the precautions that were built in about addiction. When I went to Plainville or Plainview or whatever it is for the first time, the second you walk in the door, there's a little table and it says to you, has literature and a phone number about problem gambling, whatever you want to call it. Has the Gaming Commission and has the state, the legislature, our governors, have they responsibly dealt with the issues that you work on, or has it been like pulling teeth?
100% they've been responsible and responsive. Our organization runs that center you were talking about.
Oh, it does? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
Casino, that's okay, in Plainville, Mass, by Penn National. And there's also ones on site at Encore Boston Harbor and at Springfield, MGM Springfield. And Steve Crosby actually sits on my board of directors.
Oh, really?
And so what I'll tell you is that, yes, they have. I mean, listen, we don't always see eye to eye, but I think what's been fantastic is there's always a dialogue, and whether that's the legislature, whether that's the Gaming Commission, whether that's the governor, there's been a dialogue, and everyone wants to be on the right side of public health in this discussion.
You know, David, I should have been candid with you at the beginning of this. I'm in a minority in this state, and I know I am. I don't like state-sponsored gambling in general. And it's not some puritanical position. There was a study years ago, you may have been in the legislature at this point, that was done by Tom Birmingham's committee, who went on to be the Senate president, showing that this was, the lottery was like Robin Hood in reverse. Essentially, not only did we spend more money on the lottery per capita than any state in the country by far, not even a close second, but that poor people spent much more money on it, and money ended up being transferred through local aid to richer communities. You work for a team, and it's odd to say this, and an owner, John Henry, that have a social conscience. In any part of this process, were you worried about the implications for low and moderate income people of expanding gambling yet again in Massachusetts?
Jim, it's a great question. It's a fair one. And thank you for the compliment on our team. We do try to do socially conscientious work.
I think you do, yeah.
And I think, my answer before really answers your question. There is so much illegal sports betting happening already that kind of wealth transfer is already going on, except that it's on illegal offshore apps that can't be regulated in the first place. And I'll give you a quick anecdote. As you know, many years ago, I had the honor and privilege of clerking at the U.S. Supreme Court. I was much younger. Chief Justice Rehnquist, I can say this now that a long time has gone by, ran an illegal sports betting pool out of his office for the NCAA basketball tournament. So, it's like Casablanca. There's betting happening here. I can't believe it. And once you focus on the massive amount of illegal betting, it kind of made sense to support legalization.
David, one more thing for you, and I'm embarrassed I didn't think of this until you were talking about it a minute ago. I am a huge baseball fan from when I was a kid, and I have the same problem that almost every fan has. There's so much time in between pitches. You could go argue a case before the Supreme Court. My understanding is this legislation, correct me if I'm wrong, allows for in-game betting. Am I not right about that?
That's correct for pro sports, yes.
So is baseball, I don't mean this facetiously, is baseball not tailor-made for in-game betting because of the unending pauses between pitches?
Well, I think you're right that there's a lot of people who are casual sports betting people, or people who are, more serious about it, who like those in-game proposition bets. I'll emphasize one thing we like about the legislation is it lets the leagues go to the Gaming Commission if there are problematic types of bets to ask those not to be allowed. So I'll give you an example. The first foul in an NBA game, who wants to bet on that? But it's very easy for a player to whisper to some friend, hey, I'm going to commit that first foul. It doesn't change the outcome. So the answer is yes. If someone's excited to bet on who the next home run is going to be by, or, is a particular pitcher going to strike out 6 people tonight, that's a kind of an interesting in-game bet. It keeps you engaged in the game. So we think that's kind of neat.
But the point I think you were trying to make is that you would oppose in-game bets that players could intentionally act on rather than that would not affect the outcome. Is that not where you were going?
Right. That's a consideration that the leagues and the legislature thought a lot about to try to, among other things, promote integrity. Because the last thing any of us want is for someone to doubt that these games are being played fully in a competitive spirit. Okay,
before you go, just so I know who I'm talking to, did you both buy Mega Millions tickets? Yes or no? David? No? No,
a friend of
Marlene?
mine did, but I
Well, it's the irony of this is I'm against this gambling. I bought 10 and the two of you bought none. So let's leave it there. Marlene and David, I really appreciate your time. Good luck. Be well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Take it easy.